The moment Eudora Hurst pressed her last coin into the station master's palm and heard him say it was not enough, she understood with cold certainty that the Kansas frontier had finally finished breaking her. She stood on the warped platform of the Caldwell train station in the late summer of 1883, the August heat sitting heavy as a wool blanket over everything, her traveling trunk beside her, and a ticket stub in her hand that accounted for exactly half of what she owed. The station master, a round-bellied man named Gerald Potts who wore his authority like a crown too large for his head, looked down at the coins in his palm and then back at her with the particular expression of a man who has delivered bad news so many times it no longer troubles him. "Miss, I am sorry," Gerald said, though his tone suggested he was not especially sorry at all. "Fare to Abilene is $1.60. You have 80 cents here. I cannot let you board on credit." Policy is policy. Eudora did not cry. She had cried enough in the past 3 weeks to water a field, beginning the day her uncle, Clement Hurst, had dropped dead behind his plow horse in the south field of his homestead, leaving her with nothing but a quarter section of drought-cracked earth, a pile of debts she had not known existed, and the sudden, terrifying understanding that she was 22 years old and entirely alone in a territory that had no patience for women without means or men. She had sold what she could. The plow horse, 2 chickens, a cast-iron stove that had taken 3 men to carry out of the house. She had written to her Aunt Margaret in Abilene, her mother's older sister, who had written back immediately with warmth and firmness, telling Eudora to come at once and that there was room and work enough for her. All Eudora had to do was get there. All she had to do was get there. She picked up her coins from Gerald Potts's palm, dropped them back into her coin purse, and stepped aside from the window to think. The train to Abilene was leaving in 40 minutes. She had 80 cents and needed $1.60. The platform was moderately busy for a Thursday, a handful of cowboys lounging against the depot wall, a family of settlers with too much luggage and a crying infant, a traveling merchant sorting through his sample cases. Eudora looked at each of them in the way a drowning person looks at passing logs. She did not ask any of them for help. She had her pride, and besides, she did not know these people, and the world had taught women like her early and firmly that accepting help from strangers carried its own price. She sat down on her trunk, folded her hands in her lap, and stared at the iron rails gleaming in the late morning sun. She was trying to calculate whether she could walk to Abilene. She could not. It was over 100 miles, the heat was murderous, and she had no horse. That was when Isaiah Finley walked around the corner of the depot. He was not a remarkable-looking man at first glance, or perhaps he was, and she simply did not have the presence of mind to notice it in that moment. He was tall and lean in the way of men who worked hard and ate plainly, somewhere around 27 or 28, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and needed a barber's attention. He wore trail clothes that had seen considerable use, a faded canvas jacket, worn boots, and a hat pushed back on his head at the angle of a man who had stopped caring about appearances somewhere around the 3rd month of a long drive. What she did notice, immediately, was the saddle he was carrying over his left shoulder. It was a beautiful saddle. She knew enough about horses and their gear to recognize quality, and this saddle had it in abundance. The leather was dark and well-oiled, the silver conchos along the skirt catching the sunlight with quiet elegance, the tooling along the fender depicting an intricate pattern of running horses that must have taken a craftsman many hours to complete. It was the kind of saddle a man saved up for over years, the kind he named and talked to and carried with him the way other men carried pocket watches or photographs of their mothers. Isaiah Finley set that saddle down on the platform beside the tack shop window, which stood adjacent to the train depot, and spoke to the man behind the glass. Eudora was not trying to listen. She was not the kind of woman who eavesdropped. But the platform was not large and voices carried, and she heard enough. "What will you give me for it?" Isaiah asked the man at the window. The man examined the saddle with the practiced skepticism of someone whose livelihood depended on never showing genuine enthusiasm. He turned it over, pressed on the tree, examined the stitching. Then he named a price. Eudora watched Isaiah absorb it, watched the slight tightening around his jaw that indicated the number was lower than he had hoped, and then watched him nod. "Done," Isaiah said. He walked away from the window with folded bills in his hand, and a lightness to his step that seemed deliberately constructed, as though he was choosing not to look back at the saddle. He had sold it without hesitation. Eudora found herself wondering why a man who clearly valued that saddle would sell it so readily, and she found herself also not wondering it very hard, because her own situation was pressing, and she still had no solution, and the train was now leaving in 35 minutes. It was Isaiah who looked at her first. Not in the way men sometimes looked at women on platforms, assessing and presumptuous, but in the way a person looks at someone whose stillness seems wrong for their surroundings. She was sitting very straight on her trunk, her hands folded with unnecessary precision, her eyes fixed on the rails, and something about her composure and the way she had not moved in 10 minutes apparently told him a story he felt compelled to investigate. He came to stand a few feet away, tilted his head slightly, and said, "You all right, miss?" "I am fine," Eudora said, which was such an obvious untruth that she saw him register it immediately. "You look like you're trying to solve a problem," he said. "The train leaves in half an hour." She looked up at him then, really looked, and she saw that his eyes were a clear gray-green, the color of sage after rain, and that they held the particular quality of someone who asked questions because they genuinely wanted to know the answers rather than to have something to say. "I am short on fare," she said. She did not know why she said it. Perhaps because the truth was so simple and the pretending was exhausting, and she did not have the energy left for pretending. "I need $1.60 to get to Abilene, and I have 80 cents. Isaiah was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Where are you going in Abilene?" "To my aunt's house." "She is expecting me. I have nowhere else to go." She said the last part with a quiet flatness that was more devastating than any dramatic delivery could have been, and she saw him hear it. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out the folded bills from the sale of the saddle. He peeled off what he needed, walked to Gerald Potts's window and paid for a ticket. Then he came back and held it out to her. Eudora stood up from her trunk. "Sir, I cannot accept that." "It is a train ticket," he said, "not a marriage proposal." She stared at him. "I do not know you." "My name is Isaiah Finley," he said. "I drove cattle up from Texas this spring with the Sumner outfit. I have not robbed anyone. I do not drink to excess. And I have a younger sister named Della who would be sitting in exactly the same place you are sitting if someone did not help her, and I would want someone to help her." He paused. "I am going to Abilene too. I have people there. You can ride in the ladies' car and I will be in the general car, and we do not need to speak another word to each other unless you choose to." Eudora looked at the ticket in his hand. She looked at Gerald Potts's window. She looked at the rails. "I will pay you back," she said. "That is not necessary." "I said I will pay you back," she repeated, with a quiet firmness that made him almost smile. "All right," he said. "You can pay me back." She took the ticket. She did not look at what he had traded to get the money for it. She did not notice the absence of the saddle from the platform because she had not paid enough attention to connect it to him. She only knew that a stranger named Isaiah Finley had paid her fare, and she felt the complicated mixture of relief and wounded pride and gratitude that constituted the emotional weather of a woman who had survived a terrible month and was not entirely sure what surviving felt like yet. The train came in at 11:47, puffing and hissing along the platform with the cheerful indifference of a machine that had no opinions about human troubles. Eudora found a porter to help with her trunk, confirmed her seat in the ladies' car, and settled herself beside the window as the flat Kansas landscape began to slide past. She thought about her Aunt Margaret's house, which she had visited once as a child and remembered as having blue curtains and the smell of cinnamon. She thought about what kind of work she might find. She thought, briefly and carefully and then firmly not, about the homestead she was leaving behind and the debt it carried, and the 2 years she had spent helping her uncle work it without complaint and without adequate thanks. She did not think about Isaiah Finley for the first half of the journey, and then she did, because the train stopped at a water station and she stepped out onto the small platform for air, and he was already standing there. He had a battered paperback book in one hand and an apple in the other, and he was reading the book with the focused ease of a man comfortable in his own company. He glanced up when she came out. "Hot in the general car," he said, by way of explanation for his own presence on the platform. "It is not much better in the ladies' car," she said. "No, I don't imagine it is." They stood for a moment in the comparative relief of moving air, the flat golden prairie stretching away on all sides under a sky that was enormous and cloudless, and the kind of blue that made you feel small in a way that was more awe than despair. "Why are you going to Abilene?" Eudora asked, because the silence had become the kind that invited speech rather than discouraged it. "I have a land claim," Isaiah said. "Filed it 2 years ago when I first came up from Texas, been saving to prove it up. I figure I have enough now to get started in earnest, put up a proper structure, buy some stock, try to make something that lasts." "You are going to farm?" "Ranch," he said. "Small scale to start. I know cattle. I don't know much about anything else, but I know cattle well enough to make a go of it." "What part of Texas are you from?" "West of San Antonio," he said. "Hill country. My father had a small outfit there. He died when I was 15 and we lost the land to debt shortly after, so I went to work for other men's outfits and saved everything I could." He said it plainly, without self-pity, the way people talk about the weather of their past lives. Eudora found herself thinking that he spoke about hardship the same way she had learned to, as a fact rather than a wound, and she recognized something in that, the way you recognize a dialect from your own region in a crowd of strangers. "I am sorry about your uncle," he said, and she blinked because she had not told him about her uncle. "How did you know?" "The depot master," he said. "Not gossip, he mentioned it when I was arranging the ticket. Small towns." He looked at her steadily. "It sounded recent." 3 weeks ago," she said. He nodded. He did not offer platitudes, which she was grateful for, because she had received enough platitudes in 3 weeks to last her a lifetime, and they had not helped once. The train whistle sounded, and they went back inside. Eudora thought about him for the rest of the journey. Not romantically, or not entirely romantically, but in the way you think about something that does not fit neatly into the categories you have assigned to things. He was a stranger who had given her something significant without making her feel small for receiving it. That was unusual enough to be worth thinking about. They arrived in Abilene at 3 in the afternoon. The station was busy, cattle pens visible from the platform, the smell of livestock hanging over the town the way it always did in those years when Abilene was still a working cow town, though its wildest days were already behind it by 1883, the drives beginning to shift west and south as the railroads expanded. It retained the character of a frontier town without quite the lawlessness of its earlier incarnation, more settled, more aspirational, the sort of place that was actively deciding what it wanted to become. Eudora's Aunt Margaret was on the platform before the train had fully stopped, a small, upright woman of 53 with iron-gray hair and sharp blue eyes, and the air of someone who had weathered enough of life to be genuinely happy when things went well. She embraced Eudora with a thoroughness that made Eudora's carefully maintained composure buckle just slightly at the edges. "You look thin," Margaret said, holding her at arm's length. "And tired. Come on, then. I have a room ready and supper waiting, and we are not going to talk about anything difficult until you have eaten and slept." Eudora turned to look for Isaiah Finley on the platform, intending to say goodbye properly and to reiterate her promise to repay him, but the crowd had shifted and she could not find him. She scanned the platform for a moment, feeling an odd pang at the loss of the chance to say thank you one more time, and then she followed her aunt to the waiting buggy. She asked a porter if he had seen which direction the tall, dark-haired man from the train had gone. The porter shrugged and gestured broadly at the street. Abilene had swallowed him, as towns swallowed people, and Eudora told herself she would find him and repay the debt, and that was the logical end of the matter. She settled into her Aunt Margaret's house on Vine Street with a relief so profound it felt almost like grief running in reverse. Margaret's house was warm and well organized, full of the smell of bread and dried herbs, with blue curtains exactly as Eudora had remembered. Margaret herself was a widow, her husband having died 6 years prior of a fever, and she had built herself a quiet life of purpose. She kept a large kitchen garden, sold preserves and needlework, and had recently begun serving Sunday dinner to 2 or 3 of the town's single schoolteachers, which she described as a charitable endeavor, but which Eudora suspected contained an element of social architecture. The first week passed in recovery. Eudora slept long and ate well and helped in the garden and tried not to think too much about the shape of the future. Margaret did not push. She had the wisdom to know that a woman who had been through what Eudora had been through needed time to find the floor again before she could think about walking. In the second week, Eudora began asking questions. About the town, about work, about what an unmarried woman of 22 with no formal training but considerable practical ability might do to make herself useful and independent. Margaret mentioned the dry goods store on 2nd Street, which had recently lost its seamstress. She mentioned the schoolhouse, which was always in need of teachers willing to work for modest wages. She mentioned, with a carefully casual air, that there were several respectable young men in town who were at the age of looking to settle. Eudora said, "Aunt Margaret," in the tone that ends that particular conversation. It was during the third week that she saw Isaiah Finley again. She had gone to the dry goods store to inquire about the seamstress position, wearing her best day dress, which was navy with small white buttons, and which she had mended so many times in the past year that she had become something close to expert in invisible stitching. She came out of the store with the good news that she was to start on Monday, 3 days hence, and she was feeling something close to hopeful for the first time in a month when she nearly walked into him on the boardwalk. He caught her by the elbow to keep her from stepping off the edge of the boards. "Miss Hurst," he said, recognizing her immediately. "Mr. Finley," she said, equally immediate. They stood for a moment in the slight awkwardness of unexpected reunion. "I was hoping to see you," she said. "I owe you 80 cents. "You don't," he said. "I said I would repay you, and I said you didn't need to, Mr. Finley," she said, with the particular patience of a woman who intends to win an argument but is choosing her battles carefully. "I am going to repay you. I would appreciate it if you would tell me exactly how much the ticket cost so that I can do so accurately." He looked at her for a moment with those gray-green eyes, and then something shifted in his expression, not surrender exactly, but a recognition of a will equal to his own. "$1.60, he said. She opened her coin purse and counted out $1.60 and held it out to him. He took it with a slight inclination of his head. "Thank you," she said. "Now I feel considerably better." "Good," he said, and he almost smiled. She noticed in this meeting things she had not had the attention to notice the first time. The way he stood with a quiet assurance that was not arrogance. The way he looked at her directly, without the sliding glances she had learned to armor herself against. The clean, faintly practical smell of him, leather and soap and warm, sun-baked cotton. The absence of the saddle that had been on his shoulder on the Caldwell platform. "You sold your saddle," she said. It came out before she had decided to say it, assembled itself from the pieces she had been unconsciously fitting together since Caldwell. He went still for a fraction of a second. "I'm sorry." On the platform in Caldwell. "You had a beautiful saddle and you sold it to the man at the tack shop window. The money you used to pay my fare." She watched his face. "It was the saddle, wasn't it?" Isaiah was quiet for a moment that stretched like taffy, and she saw something move across his face that was not quite discomfort and not quite pride but was perhaps both at once. "It was time to sell it," he said. "That is not what I asked," she said. He looked at her steadily and did not say anything more. You sold your saddle, Eudora said again slowly, to pay my train fare, a stranger's train fare, with a saddle that looked as though it meant something to you. I needed the money more than the saddle, he said carefully, which was not precisely a lie but was not the truth either. You said you were going to start a ranch, she said. A man starting a ranch needs a saddle considerably more than he needs 80 cents. Isaiah Finley looked out at the street for a moment, at the wagons and horses and the general busy machinery of an Abilene afternoon, and then he looked back at her. You were sitting on that trunk like someone who had been fighting for a long time and had just run out of fight, he said. I have seen that look before. I have worn that look before. I did not want to leave a person sitting in that look when it was in my power to do something about it. Eudora absorbed this. Thank you, she said finally, and this time it had a different weight than the polite thank you she had offered with the coins. This thank you had depth to it, had the recognition of what the gesture had actually cost and what it had actually meant. Her voice had something in it that she did not fully control. It was a saddle, he said quietly, in the tone of someone trying to minimize something they are actually quite proud of. It was your saddle, she said. She looked at him for a moment that was different from the looking at strangers she had been doing on the platform in Caldwell. Then she said, I start work at the dry goods store on Monday. Perhaps you will allow me to buy you a meal as further partial repayment for my debt. I told you, you've repaid the debt. The monetary debt, she said. The other kind is harder to account for. He agreed to supper on Saturday evening. She walked back to her aunt's house on Vine Street with the sensation of someone who has been moving in one direction and has just discovered, unexpectedly, that the road has gently curved. Margaret noticed her expression the moment she came through the door. Something has happened, Margaret said. I found the man who paid my train fare, Eudora said. He sold his saddle to do it and I did not know until just now. Margaret set down her rolling pin. Tell me about him, she said. Saturday's supper was at the hotel dining room on Main Street, which was the closest thing Abilene had to a proper restaurant in 1883. It was not fancy by any standards that would apply 10 years later, but it had tablecloths and a menu written on a chalkboard and a cook who had trained in St. Louis before deciding the frontier suited him better, which meant the food was genuinely good rather than merely adequate. Eudora wore her navy dress again because it was her best and she had spent Thursday evening pressing it with Margaret's flat iron. She arrived 3 minutes before the agreed time and found Isaiah already there, wearing a clean shirt that was clearly newly purchased for the occasion, his hair recently barbered, his hat in his hand. He had made an effort, and she noticed the effort, and the noticing of it did something warm and specific to her chest. They talked for 3 hours. This was not what either of them had expected. They had expected the polite, slightly stiff exchange of two people with a reason to be civil and a background of awkward circumstance. What they got instead was something considerably more interesting. Isaiah told her about the land claim, 20 acres east of town near Mud Creek, not large but well watered, with good grass and a natural windbreak of cottonwoods along the northern edge. He had been working it on weekends for 2 years, had put up a small cabin and a fence line, and had recently acquired 2 young heifers on credit from a rancher north of town who had taken a liking to his persistence. Eudora told him about the homestead in Caldwell, about her Uncle Clement who had been a difficult man and an indifferent farmer, but who had taken her in when her mother died 4 years ago and given her a roof, and about the strange grief of losing someone you had complicated feelings for, which was its own particular kind of mourning. He listened to the parts that were hard to say without rushing past them or offering remedies, and she found herself saying things she had not said out loud before, small and specific things about her uncle and the homestead, and the year before his death when the drought had been worst, and the tension in the house had been like a held breath. Isaiah listened to all of it. What made you leave Texas, she asked, besides the land being lost? It wasn't leaving Texas, he said. It was going somewhere. There is a difference. He turned his water glass in his hands looking at it. I had a sense, around the time I turned 22 or 23, that the version of life available to me in Texas as a hired hand was not the version of life I wanted. I wanted land. Not because land is the whole of ambition, but because land is continuity. It is something that stays. I wanted something that stayed. Eudora thought about that. I have never had something that stayed, she said. Not since my mother died. No, he said. Neither have I. There was a moment then across the white tablecloth that had the quality of recognition. Not romantic recognition exactly, though it was becoming that, but something more fundamental, two people discovering that they were made of similar materials, had been shaped by similar pressures, and had arrived at similar conclusions about what mattered. They talked about books, which was unexpected. He had been reading on the train, and it turned out he read widely if not formally educated, whatever he could find in the bunkhouses and general stores of the trail. She had been a reader since childhood, her mother having been a schoolteacher who had pressed books into her hands with the urgency of someone transmitting something essential. They had both read Twain. They disagreed, cordially and with increasing animation, about the relative merits of Roughing It versus Adventures of Tom Sawyer, and the disagreement had the quality of a conversation between two people who are enjoying the disagreement as much as any agreement. When they walked out of the hotel at 9 o'clock, the evening air had cooled and the stars over Abilene were extravagant, the kind of sky you can only see far from cities, dense and brilliant and close. Isaiah walked her toward Vine Street without being asked. I enjoyed the evening, he said when they reached the gate of Margaret's house. As did I, she said. There was a pause in which several things could have been said and were not because the things that needed to be said were not ready yet, needed more time to form properly. Would you like to see the land, he asked. The claim. I could take you out there Sunday afternoon if your aunt can spare you. She thought about it. I would like that, she said. She went inside. Margaret was sitting in the parlor with her needlework in her lap but her eyes nowhere near it. Well, said Margaret. Sunday he is going to show me his land claim, Eudora said. Margaret made a sound that was not quite a word but conveyed a great deal. He is a good man, Eudora said quietly. I think he might be a genuinely good man. Those are not as common as they ought to be, Margaret said. No, said Eudora, they are not. The Sunday afternoon was golden in the way that late summer afternoons sometimes are in Kansas, the light tilting and amber, the heat having relented to something merely warm rather than punishing, the whole world seeming, for a few hours, to be operating at its best capacity. Isaiah had borrowed a horse and a simple buggy from his neighbor, a weathered farmer named Clyde Hobbs, who was the sort of man who had horses to lend and lent them without requiring excessive explanation. The drive east of town took them through flat farmland, and then into slightly rougher country where the creek ran through, and the cottonwoods stood tall and rustling, leaves catching the afternoon light. Isaiah pulled the buggy to a stop on a small rise, and Eudora looked out at the 20 acres below. It was not impressive in any conventional sense. There was a cabin, small and solid, built from lumber and local stone in the practical way of frontier structures that have to be weather-tight rather than beautiful. There was a fence line in good repair, the posts solid and well set. There was a vegetable garden that had been tended with more enthusiasm than skill, and 2 young heifers grazing in the lower pasture with the placid contentment of animals that had no ambitions. The cottonwoods along the north edge moved in the light wind. But it was land, real land, and it had been worked, and the working of it was visible in every post and every turned row and the clean line of the fence, and Eudora felt the particular emotion of looking at something that had been made from nothing through sustained effort, which is among the most moving things in the world. It's not much yet, Isaiah said from beside her. It is more than you had, she said. He looked at her with something that was quiet and unguarded in a way that his face generally was not. They walked down to the land. She asked practical questions about the water source, the soil quality, his plans for expanding the stock. He answered them seriously, as a person who has thought deeply about something and is pleased to be asked. He showed her the inside of the cabin, which was spare and clean and smelled of fresh-cut wood and pine pitch. There was a table, 2 chairs, a bunk, a small cast-iron stove, and a shelf of books. She looked at the shelf. "You did not exaggerate about the reading." "Never," he said solemnly, and she laughed, and it was the first time she had laughed without reservation in a month. The laugh transformed her face in a way that Isaiah watched with an attention he was not entirely successful in concealing, and she caught him watching, and neither of them looked away for a moment that stretched long enough to be something other than accidental. They sat outside the cabin in the slanting afternoon light and talked until the sun was low, and then he drove her back to town in the long golden dusk. And when he dropped her at Margaret's gate, he was aware of wanting very much to see her again. They began to meet regularly in the weeks that followed. Sunday drives were one thing, but there were also accidental meetings at the dry goods store, where Eudora worked her sewing machine with growing efficiency, and at the library reading room, where they sometimes arrived separately on Tuesday evenings and ended up staying until the librarian, a small fierce woman named Mrs. Crane, chased them both out at closing time. There were walks along the creek on cool evenings when Eudora's working day was done and Isaiah came in from the land. There was the conversation that ran continuously between them, shifting and deepening and doubling back on itself, the kind of conversation that is essentially ongoing and simply pauses when they are not in each other's presence. By October, Eudora was aware that she was in considerable danger of falling in love with Isaiah Finley, and she found the awareness more alarming than she would have expected. She had not permitted herself to think much about love before this. There had been a boy, 3 years ago in Caldwell, who had paid her attention for a season and then married the miller's daughter, and the experience had left her with the firm impression that her own feelings were a liability rather than an asset. She had channeled everything into practical concerns, into survival and work, and the unglamorous business of maintaining her place in a world that did not make it easy for women without resources. She had been efficient about her feelings, which is another way of saying she had been unkind to herself about them. Isaiah was not making it possible to be efficient. She found, increasingly, that the hours she spent with him were the hours she felt most like herself. The self she had been before the years of difficulty had required her to compress and armor. He made space for that self without seeming to try. He listened the way good readers read, closely and with genuine interest, holding the space of what she said without rushing to fill it with his own voice. When he disagreed with her, he said so directly and without apology, which she found she preferred enormously to the more common approach of agreeable men who agreed with everything, and thereby gave you nothing to push against. She talked to Margaret about it one evening in November, sitting at the kitchen table after supper with the oil lamp turned low and the wind coming down from the north in the first genuine cold of the season. "I am afraid," Eudora said, which was not the kind of thing she said easily. "Of what?" Margaret asked. "Of being wrong about him." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "Of discovering that what I see is not what is there. Of deciding I trust someone and having that trust be the mistake I cannot recover from. Is there anything specific that makes you doubt him?" Eudora thought about this honestly. "No," she said. "That is nearly what frightens me. There is nothing. He is consistent. Is honest. He says what he means and does what he says. He is kind without being saccharine. He is ambitious without being ruthless." She paused. "I keep waiting to find the thing that is wrong and it is not there." "Perhaps," Margaret said, "that is because it is not there." "People have hidden things," Eudora said. "They do," Margaret agreed. "And some people don't. And the art of it is learning to tell the difference, which is an inexact science and always has been." She covered Eudora's hand with her own. "What does your instinct tell you?" Eudora was quiet for a long moment. "My instinct tells me he is who he appears to be," she said. "Then perhaps," said Margaret, "you should trust your instinct." The first frost came in mid-November, and the land around Abilene went gray and bronze, and the cottonwoods along Mud Creek dropped their leaves in long, rustling curtains. Isaiah had the cabin well chinked and tight before the cold hit, had laid in a supply of wood, had moved his heifers to a borrowed barn for the winter, and was spending the colder months planning and doing the 1,000 small repairs and preparations that would allow him to expand meaningfully in the spring. He was also, more consciously than he would have been able to say a month ago, thinking about Eudora Hurst. Not in the scattered way he had been thinking about her before, but with the directed attention of a man who has understood something and is deciding what to do with the understanding. He had spent a considerable portion of his adult life in environments where the practical necessities consumed all available thought, where thinking beyond the next season was a luxury, and where the idea of a life that included another person to build it with had been somewhere in the abstract future, where he stored things he could not afford to examine closely. Eudora was not abstract. She was specific and present and entirely real, and the effect of her reality on him was something he could no longer pretend was simply friendship. He understood this in full one Tuesday evening in November in the library reading room, when she read him a passage from a book she had found, something about the particular quality of light on prairie winters, and she looked up from the book and her eyes were bright, and she was laughing at something the writer had said, and he thought with a clarity that was almost physical that he wanted to be in every room she was in for the rest of his life. The thought did not frighten him. It clarified things considerably. He asked her to walk with him the following Sunday, a longer walk than usual, out past the town's edge toward the creek, and she came in her wool coat with her dark hair braided and pinned, and her breath making small clouds in the cold air, and they walked for a while without speaking in the comfortable way of people who have established that silence is not a problem between them. "Eudora," he said, eventually. "Yes," she said, with the air of someone who has been expecting her name to be said in that particular tone. He stopped walking and turned to look at her, and she stopped and looked back at him, and the November light was low and pale and the whole world was very quiet around them, the creek running quietly, the bare trees standing dark and still. "I want to tell you something," he said, "and I want to tell you honestly and without any particular strategy, because I think that is the only way I know how to do this and probably the only way that would work with you." "That is probably accurate," she said. "I am in love with you," he said. "I have been for some time. I think you are the best person I have met in my life, and I think that is not a small thing to find, and I do not want to be careless with it." He looked at her steadily, in the direct way that had been one of the first things she noticed about him. "I would like to court you properly, if you are willing, with the understanding that my intention is ultimately to ask you to marry me." Eudora stood in the pale November light and felt the truth of her own feelings like something that had been behind a door she had been holding shut, and she understood that she had been holding it shut not because she did not know what was behind it, but because she had been afraid of how much of it there was. "I am in love with you too," she said. "I have been trying to be sensible about it." "And," he said, "and being sensible about it is not working," she said, "and I have decided to stop trying." He took one step forward and took her face in both his hands and kissed her, slowly and with great care. The way a person kisses someone when they understand it is the beginning of something rather than a conclusion. And the Kansas wind moved around them and the creek ran on, and it was very cold and neither of them noticed. They were formally courting after that, which in 1883 Abilene meant that Isaiah called at Margaret's house on designated evenings, that they attended church together on Sunday mornings, followed by Sunday dinner, where Margaret observed him with the sharp benevolence of a woman running a thorough assessment, and eventually pronounced herself satisfied. And that the nature of their relationship was visible and understood by the town in the way that small frontier towns always understood these things immediately and completely. December brought hard cold and short days and the particular enclosed quality of prairie winter, and Isaiah spent more time in town than on the land by necessity, and the time in town was largely organized around being with Eudora. They read together in the evenings, books spread between them on Margaret's kitchen table, arguing happily about characters and ideas. He began teaching her to play chess, having learned from an old Mexican vaquero on a cattle drive years ago, and she was a fast and unexpectedly ruthless player who had him worried for his own record within 3 weeks. She began teaching him to bake bread, which Margaret thought was hilarious and Eudora thought was practical, since a man living alone on a land claim ate too much cold food and the knowledge would serve him. He was easy to laugh with. She had not expected that. She had known he was reliable and honest and serious when seriousness was called for, but the ease of laughing with him, the way humor moved through their conversations naturally and without effort, was something that delighted her freshly every time. He had a dry wit that appeared at unexpected moments and a genuine appreciation for the absurd, and she loved this in him with a specificity she would not have been able to predict. The question of his land and her work, and how they would manage as a practical matter when they married, was something they discussed directly and without embarrassment, because both of them had learned that practical matters left undiscussed became practical problems, and they had both had enough of problems. "I do not intend to stop working," she said clearly, one evening in January. "I enjoy the work and I am good at it, and we will need the income while the ranch is getting established." "I would not ask you to stop," he said equally clearly. "I would not want you to. There are men who say that before marriage and feel differently after," she said. "There may be," he said. "I am not going to be one of them. You are not a less complicated or interesting person because we are married. You are going to be the same person you are now. I want the same person you are now." He looked at her. "I did not fall in love with a woman I intended to rearrange." She absorbed this. Then she said with a directness that matched his, "I believe you." She did. That was the thing. She had arrived at believing him as at a place she had been traveling toward without knowing the destination, and now that she was there it felt obvious and right. He proposed properly in February, in the way that felt right to him and to her, which was not with ceremony or spectacle but with honesty. They were sitting at the kitchen table at the land claim cabin, having driven out on a bright cold Saturday to do some work on the place together, and they had spent the afternoon rearranging the interior and discussing what would need to change when 2 people lived there instead of 1. And at some point, they were both sitting at the table with coffee, and the conversation had arrived at the place it had been heading for some time. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want to build this place with you, and I want to grow old with you, and I want to have children with you if that is something you want. I do not have a great deal to offer you materially at this point. I have the land which is improving and the cattle which are few and a cabin that needs enlargement and everything I intend to make of all of it. I have my word which I keep. I have considerable feeling for you which will not diminish." He paused. "Will you marry me?" Eudora set down her coffee cup. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." They were married in April of 1884, on a Saturday when the prairie was coming green again, and the cottonwoods along Mud Creek were putting out their new leaves, fine and bright and trembling in the spring wind. The ceremony was at the Methodist Church on Spruce Street, simple and brief, which was how they both preferred it. Margaret cried, which she would have strongly denied if accused of it. Clyde Hobbs came and sat in the front row with his wife and 3 grown children. 2 of Isaiah's fellow drovers from the Sumner outfit, who happened to be in town between drives, came in trail clothes and stood in the back and applauded, which the Methodist minister bore with patience. Eudora wore a dress she had made herself, white cotton with small eyelet trim, practical enough to be wearable afterward but with enough beauty that she felt herself in it. And she stood beside Isaiah in the April morning light and said the words she meant with her whole self, because she had decided months ago that she would not say them unless she meant them absolutely, and she did. Isaiah stood very straight and looked at her as he said his vows with an expression that she would see on his face at other significant moments throughout their life together, quietly overwhelmed and deeply sure simultaneously, as though the emotion was large enough to be surprising, but the rightness of it was beyond question. They went back to the land claim after. There was a small gathering at the cabin, bread and roasted chicken, and 2 pies that Margaret had produced with the focused energy of a woman with a mission. And people stood in the April afternoon around the cabin and the yard, and the talk was warm and ordinary and very good. It was that evening, after the guests had gone and Margaret had been driven back to town, and the 2 of them were alone in the cabin for the first time as a married couple, sitting at the table with the oil lamp burning low and the sounds of the night prairie coming through the walls, that Eudora told him she knew. "About the saddle," she said. "I have been thinking about it since the day I realized, about what it meant." Isaiah was quiet. "You had never met me," she said. "You had spoken to me for approximately 30 seconds, and you sold your saddle." "It was a practical calculation," he said, which was not true, and they both knew it. "Isaiah," she said. He looked at her in the lamplight. "I cannot fully explain it," he said. "I'm not sure I have words for it. I looked at you on that platform and I thought, this person should not be sitting here unable to get where she is going. That is not a thought I would have had about everyone, but I had it about you." He paused. "I suppose I noticed you. Before I knew anything else, I simply noticed you." She reached across the table and took his hand. "It was the kindest thing anyone had ever done for me," she said. "And you did not know me. And you never said anything about it." "There was nothing to say," he said. "I did not want your gratitude. I just wanted you to be able to go." She thought about what it meant to be known by someone, truly known, in the way that requires no performance and carries no debt. She thought about the train platform in Caldwell and the tired woman on the trunk and the man with the saddle, and the improbable, irreversible chain of events that had led from there to here, to this table, this lamplight, this hand. "I did not know until I was already your wife," she said, "and somehow that seems right. That I should find out after the question of us was already settled." "Are you glad," he said, "to know?" "I am glad about everything that led to this table," she said, with an exactness that left nothing ambiguous. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed it, and they stayed at the table for a long time in the warm lamplight, talking about everything and nothing, the easy and unending conversation of 2 people who have found their home in each other. Spring moved into summer and summer into fall, and the rhythm of life on the land claim established itself with the combination of hard work and deep satisfaction that is the best of what frontier homesteading offered to the people who came through it successfully. Eudora kept her seamstress position at the dry goods store through the summer months, 3 days a week, and used the income to pay down the small remaining debt on the heifers and to put by a fund for lumber, because the cabin needed to be larger before winter and before anything else they were planning for. Isaiah had added 2 more heifers by July, on a straightforward trade arrangement with a rancher named Huckabee west of town, and was learning the intricate calendar of small-scale cattle ranching, the cycles of breeding and calving and moving stock between pastures, the mathematics of feed and water through the different seasons. He was not without setbacks. A fence breach in August that let the cattle out onto Clyde Hobbs's corn and required both repair and apology. A bout of illness in one of the younger animals that kept him awake for 3 nights watching her in the barn until she recovered. A stretch of dry weather in September that had him watching the creek level with the particular anxiety of anyone who depends on a water source. But he moved through each of these things with the steadiness that was his fundamental quality, fixing what could be fixed, accepting what could not, and continuing. Eudora was useful to all of it in ways that extended well beyond the financial contribution of her wages. She had a practical intelligence that was highly specific and concrete, a gift for seeing what needed doing and going directly to it. And she had the additional advantage of having watched her uncle's failed farm long enough to understand the mistakes she was not going to repeat. She kept the books, clear and meticulous columns in a ledger she had bought at the dry goods store, and she knew at any moment exactly where they stood. She kept the kitchen garden with increasing skill, and the root cellar well stocked by October. She negotiated their credit at the dry goods store with a firm pleasantness that got them better terms than most. What she had not fully anticipated was how much she would love the land itself. She had thought of it as Isaiah's endeavor, the dream he had been building toward, and her role in it as supportive and practical. But the land turned out to have claims on her too, the specific beauty of the 20 acres near Mud Creek, the way the light moved across it through the seasons, the way the cottonwoods spoke in different voices in different winds, the creek running steady and patient through the hot months and moving slower in the cold ones. She found herself attached to it in a way that was not rational and did not need to be. She told Isaiah about this one evening in late October, standing at the fence and watching the sunset turn the western sky the color of heated copper. "I understand now," she said, "why you wanted something that stayed." He stood beside her and looked at the same sky. "You did not before." "I understood it intellectually," she said. "I understand it now in the body. There is a difference." He put his arm around her, and she leaned into his side, and they watched the light change until the color went out of it and the first stars appeared. The addition to the cabin was completed in November. 2 extra rooms built with lumber from town, and the labor of Isaiah and Clyde Hobbs, and 3 other neighboring men who arrived on a Saturday with tools, and the unspoken understanding that this was how it was done out here. People helping people because everyone needed help at some point, and it was better to be the kind of community that did it. Eudora fed them all, and Margaret came out for the day to help with the cooking, and the whole thing had the character of a barn raising without the barn, work and warmth, and the specific pleasure of a community being a community. When it was done and the last neighbors had gone home in the early dark, Isaiah and Eudora stood in the new room that would be for children when children came, and it was empty and smelled of fresh wood and cold November air coming through the new window, and it felt full of possibility in the way that empty rooms sometimes do. In March of 1885, Eudora discovered she was expecting a child. She told Isaiah on a quiet Sunday morning, sitting across from him at the breakfast table, and she watched his face move through surprise and calculation, and then something that was simply joy, uncomplicated and complete. "Are you well?" he asked first, which was both the practical question and the meaningful one. "I am very well," she said. He came around the table and took her face in his hands in the way he had the first time he kissed her, on the cold November creek bank, and kissed her with a tenderness that she felt all the way through. The pregnancy was not easy in its early months. A persistent nausea that kept her from the dry goods store for 3 weeks and required Margaret to come and stay, which Margaret did with great willingness, and only a moderate amount of "I told you to eat more." But Eudora came through the difficult portion, and the later months were steadier. She kept her work reduced rather than stopped, because she was not the kind of woman who stopped doing things when she was capable of continuing them, and her employer at the dry goods store, a pragmatic woman named Helen Marsh, who had run the store alone for 6 years after her husband's death, accommodated her with the practical solidarity of one capable woman for another. Isaiah was attentive through all of it in the specific way she appreciated most, present when she needed him, and not hovering when she did not. He had strong opinions about the quality of the water from the creek and spent considerable time ensuring it was clean and safe. He drove her to see the town doctor, a Dr. Robert Whitfield, for regular appointments without being asked. He built, during the evenings of her second trimester, a wooden cradle that was the best piece of furniture he had ever made, sanded to smoothness and fitted with curved rockers that worked perfectly. The baby was born in early November of 1885, a boy, delivered by the town midwife Mrs. Agatha Sims with Margaret in attendance and Isaiah waiting outside the bedroom door in a state of controlled agony that resolved entirely when he heard the first cry. They named him Clement Isaiah Finley, the first name for Eudora's uncle, given in the spirit of complicated love rather than simple memory, and the middle name for his father. Clement was a solid, determined baby with his father's gray-green eyes and his mother's dark hair, and he approached the world from his first weeks with the air of someone who has questions and intends to ask them all. Isaiah held him with the careful wonder of a man encountering something precious enough to make him rethink his understanding of what precious meant, and Eudora watched him hold their son, and felt the fullness of the moment like something she had not known she was waiting for, but recognized completely on arrival. Margaret was a devoted grandmother in everything but the formal title, since she was technically a graytan, but the distinction was irrelevant. She drove out to the land claim twice a week through the winter and held Clement and taught him, somewhat early, to be interested in birds outside the window, and argued with Eudora about swaddling techniques with the cheerful certainty of someone who has always been right and always will be. The winter of 1885 into 1886 was hard, the kind of hard that Kansas winters could be, a series of ice storms that kept them close to the cabin for weeks at a time. But the cabin was solid and well-stocked, the stove was adequate, and the enforced proximity of the four walls was not a hardship between two people who were genuinely glad of each other's company. They read aloud in the evenings, taking turns, working through their accumulated books with Clement in his cradle listening to the cadences of language with round-eyed seriousness. Isaiah tried to explain cattle management to a 2-month-old baby with enough sincerity that Eudora spent 5 minutes unable to speak for laughing. He should know what he's inheriting, Isaiah said, entirely seriously. He is 2 months old, Eudora said, still laughing. Early foundations, Isaiah said. She loved this man. She loved him in specific and increasing ways, the way you love someone not as an idea or an aspiration, but as an actual person whose specific qualities have lodged themselves in your understanding of what the world is and how it works. She loved the way he moved through difficulty with steadiness and through joy with the same lack of armor. She loved the way he treated every person he encountered, from Clyde Hobbs to the Chinese railroad workers who sometimes passed through the town in those years, and were treated badly by most and treated by Isaiah with the simple courtesy he extended to everyone, because he had been at the bottom of a social arrangement himself, and had not forgotten what that felt like. The question of fairness and injustice was something they talked about in the long evenings. The treaties broken with the Cheyenne and Arapaho and the other peoples who had lived on this land before it became Kansas territory. The freedmen who had come out to the frontier in numbers after the war and were building their own communities with the same determined hopefulness as everyone else and facing resistances the others did not have to face. The women working alongside men for equal difficulty and unequal recognition. Isaiah had opinions about all of it that were consistent with his character, which was to say that he thought fairness was not a complicated concept and that the refusal of it was a kind of cowardice. Eudora had opinions that were sharper and more personal, formed by years of occupying the particular vulnerability of being a woman without resources, and they talked about these things with the honesty they brought to everything, sometimes agreeing, sometimes not, always listening. By the spring of 1886, Isaiah had a genuine small ranch operation taking shape. 8 head of cattle now, a working relationship with 2 neighboring ranchers for shared pasture access, a reputation in the county as reliable and honest and good with stock. He had learned from everyone willing to teach him, had made mistakes and learned from those too, and was becoming through the accumulating seasons the rancher he had pictured in the abstract future of his younger self. The land claim was proved up, the deed fully his, and he had the deed framed, which Eudora teased him about and which he accepted with serene equanimity. "It is my land," he said. "I can frame the deed." "You could paper the entire cabin with it if you liked," she said. "The cabin has good chinking," he said. "No room for paper," she laughed. Clement, 10 months old and beginning to have opinions about gravity, looked up from his position on the floor to see what was funny. Eudora returned to full working hours at the dry goods store in April when Clement was old enough, and Margaret's twice-weekly visits made reliable childcare possible. Helen Marsh had kept her position open through the winter with the quiet loyalty of a woman who recognized good work when she had it and did not intend to let it go. And Eudora returned to the sewing machine with a competence that had not diminished and a renewed appreciation for the specific satisfaction of work done with skill. In the summer of 1886, a man came through Abilene looking for Isaiah Finley. His name was Reg Sumner, the son of the outfit owner Isaiah had worked for on his last cattle drive, and he was traveling through on his way to Colorado and had heard Isaiah was established near Abilene and had stopped to see how he was getting on. He was a broad, sun-weathered man of about 40 with a direct manner and an appraising eye, and he and Isaiah sat on the porch of the cabin on a July evening with coffee while Eudora put Clement to bed and then came out to sit with them in the warm dark. "You've done well," Reg Sumner said, looking at the land in the evening light, the fence lines, the cattle visible in the lower pasture. "Better than most men who come up from the drives with the same plan." "I had a reason to do well," Isaiah said, and looked at Eudora. Sumner was good company. He told stories of the trail that were funny and some that were not, and talked about the changes coming to the cattle business, the railroads cutting closer to the ranges and reducing the need for the long drives, the fencing of the open range that was accelerating year by year, the sense that the old way of things was becoming a memory faster than anyone had quite expected. "You got out at the right time and into the right thing," he said to Isaiah. "The man who owns the land is going to be the man who has something in 20 years. The man who just rides it is going to be looking for work." After Sumner had gone to his hotel for the night, Isaiah and Eudora sat on the porch in the dark for a while. "Do you miss it?" she asked. "The drives." He thought about it honestly. "The open part of it," he said. "The space. There was something about being 3 weeks into a drive and having nothing in front of you and nothing behind you but grass. I miss that occasionally." He looked at her. "But missing it is not the same as wanting it back." "Good," she said. "I have considerably better things here," he said. "Yes," she said, "you do." He reached over and took her hand where it lay on the arm of her chair, and they sat in the warm July dark with the cottonwoods breathing and the cattle settling for the night and the lamp glow from the cabin window behind them. And the contentment of it was so complete it had almost the quality of sadness, the way extreme beauty sometimes does. The following year, 1887, brought a second pregnancy, and this one was easier from the beginning, Eudora feeling more confident in her own body's capability and more prepared for the particular demands of the experience. Clement was nearly 2, walking with great conviction and talking in the urgent, incomplete sentences of someone who has too many ideas for his current vocabulary, and he was deeply interested in the cattle, which gave him and his father a common subject around which to build an increasingly entertaining relationship. Isaiah had begun using the term son with an ease and naturalness that had appeared one day and simply remained, and Clement had begun using the term papa with the same lack of ceremony, and watching the two of them together was one of the reliable pleasures of Eudora's days. Isaiah's patience with the toddler's questions about the heifers having no apparent bottom, Clement's profound seriousness about information imparted to him. The second child was born in January of 1888, a girl this time, whom they named Ada Margaret Finley. Ada Margaret after her mother's middle name, which had been her grandmother's, and Margaret for the woman who had given them all a place to land. Margaret, told of the name, said nothing for a long moment, and then turned to the window with a careful movement that suggested she had something in her eye. Ada was small and fierce from her first hours, with strong opinions about sleeping and feeding, and being put down when she preferred to be held, and she had her mother's dark hair and her grandmother's sharp blue eyes, and an expression of focused intensity that Isaiah said she got from Eudora and Eudora said was entirely her own development. She was born knowing what she wanted, Isaiah said, in the small hours of Ada's third night when Eudora was nursing her in the chair by the stove and Isaiah was awake, because he was always awake when Eudora was awake, not from obligation but from the habit of sharing, the same instinct that made him put 2 cups on the table every morning without thinking. Most of the interesting women I have ever known were born that way, Eudora said. Present company included, he said. Present company very much included, she agreed. He smiled at her across the lamplight, with Ada between them and Clement sleeping soundly in the other room, and the winter wind moving around the tight walls of the cabin that had grown into a proper house by increments, and Eudora thought about a train platform in Caldwell in 1883, and a woman sitting on a trunk with 80 cents and nowhere to go. And she felt for that woman the profound tenderness you feel for the earlier version of yourself, who could not yet see what was coming. What was coming had been this. Had been Isaiah's gray-green eyes and his steady way and his dry humor and the saddle he had sold without telling her. Had been 20 acres near Mud Creek and the deed framed on the wall and 2 heifers becoming 8 becoming more. Had been Margaret at Sunday dinner and Clyde Hobbs borrowing and lending, and the community of it, the particular warmth of being known in a place. Had been Clement with his father's eyes asking questions about cattle. Had been Ada Margaret fierce and bright, and already taking up her rightful amount of space in the world. Spring came to the land claim in the way it always came to the Kansas prairie, without announcement and then all at once, the brown going to green overnight almost, the cottonwoods unfurling their new leaves with a sound like quiet applause, the creek running full with snowmelt, and the cattle moving to the spring pasture with the purposeful ease of animals following their own seasonal knowledge. Isaiah was in the middle of expanding the herd to 12 head by the end of the year, a goal arrived at through careful calculation, and was planning an additional pasture fence on the east side of the property. Eudora had, by this point, been offered a partnership arrangement at the dry goods store by Helen Marsh, who was thinking about retirement and thinking about it seriously. Helen was 59, had run the store alone for 12 years and successfully for most of them, and she had watched Eudora work for 4 years with the eye of a woman who knows good business sense when she sees it. The arrangement she proposed was straightforward. Eudora would take a half-ownership stake, paid out of the profits over 3 years, and assume management responsibilities, with Helen staying in an advisory role for the first year. Eudora brought this to Isaiah the same evening she received the proposal, sitting at the kitchen table after the children were asleep, and laid it out completely, the numbers and the terms and her own assessment of the risks and opportunities. "It is a good offer," he said when she finished. "It is a very good offer," she agreed. "What do you think?" "I think it's your decision," he said, "because it's your work. I will tell you what I think the numbers indicate if that is useful, but the decision is yours." "I know it's mine," she said. "I am asking what you think." He looked at the numbers she had written out. "I think you should do it," he said. "I think you are capable of running that store better than it has been run, which is saying something because Helen Marsh has run it well. I think the financial arrangement is fair. I think you want to do it." He paused. "Do you want to do it?" "Yes," she said. "Then you should." She took the partnership. It was the right decision, and she knew it was the right decision from the first week, the way the responsibility fit her like something made for her specific shape. Helen stayed on as promised, helpful and increasingly comfortable with stepping back, and by the end of the first year it was genuinely Eudora's operation. She renamed nothing and changed little that was working, but added a small selection of books and periodicals and a better organized bulk goods section. And within 2 years, the dry goods store on 2nd Street was visibly the most efficiently run business of its kind in Abilene. The partnership and management occupied 3 of Eudora's 5 working days, with the other 2 available for the ranch and the children and the general business of a life well lived. The 2 enterprises, Isaiah's ranch and Eudora's store, gave them a combined stability that was the foundation for everything else. Not wealth by any grand measure, but the genuine security of not worrying about tomorrow, which is the best of what financial stability actually offers. Clement started school in the fall of 1890, at 5 years old, wearing new boots that Isaiah had saved up for, and carrying a lunch pail that Eudora had packed the evening before with the thoroughness of someone taking no chances with her child's first impression of the world of formal education. He marched down the road to the schoolhouse with his father's stride already, a small person in large boots, serious and eager, and Eudora watched him go with a feeling so specific and so large that she stood at the gate for a long moment after he had turned the corner. Isaiah came and stood beside her. "He will be fine," he said. "I know he will," she said. "That is not what I am feeling." "What are you feeling?" She thought about it. "That they are separate people," she said. "I know that sounds obvious. But there is something about watching him walk away on his own that makes it absolutely real in a way it was not before." Isaiah put his arm around her. "That is the whole point of it," he said quietly. "They are supposed to go." "I know," she said. "I know it, and I am glad of it, and I am also standing here feeling whatever this is." "Whatever this is," he said, "is perfectly reasonable." Clement came home from his first day with a scraped knee. A new friend named Thomas Hobbs, who was Clyde's grandson, and who he planned to marry someday according to his current understanding of friendship commitments, and more information than he could communicate in the 3 hours before dinner. He ate with the energy of someone who had used up a great deal of themselves and needed refueling urgently, and then fell asleep so completely that Isaiah carried him to bed without waking him. Ada started school 2 years later and approached it with the focused intensity with which she approached everything. A child who was going to take everything offered and demand more, and whose teacher within the first month had sent a note home saying Ada Margaret Finley asked more questions in 1 week than most students asked in a year, which was offered as the compliment it genuinely was. By 1892, the ranch had grown to 22 head of cattle and 4 horses, the herd management now requiring a consistent part-time hand who came 3 days a week. A young man named Pablo Contreras who had come up from Texas the prior year, and who knew horses and cattle the way people know things they were born understanding. Isaiah paid him fairly and treated him with straightforward respect, and Pablo became, over the following years, a fixed and valued part of the operation. The house had been expanded twice more and was by this point a genuine home with 4 proper rooms and a full porch on 2 sides and curtains that Eudora had made herself. A different blue from Margaret's curtains, but the same instinct. Margaret visited twice a week still, because Margaret at 62 had not slowed materially and had opinions about the grandchildren that required in-person delivery. She had recently begun teaching Clement to play chess with a seriousness of purpose that put him in the unusual position of learning the game from 2 different instructors with different strategies, both of whom were convinced their method was superior and were maneuvering for influence with the same child. "You are undermining my teaching," Isaiah told Margaret one Sunday. "I am supplementing it," Margaret said. Clement, observing this exchange, said, with the flat practicality of a 7-year-old, "You both think differently, so I am learning to think both ways." Isaiah and Margaret looked at each other. "He is your child," Margaret said to Eudora. "He is entirely his own child," Eudora said, with absolute satisfaction. There was a period in the winter of 1892 when Isaiah had what he later described, minimizing as was his habit, as a rough patch. It was in fact several months of a deep tiredness that went beyond physical, a stretch in which the accumulated weight of the years of building, the constant vigilance required to keep a small operation solvent, the fear that ran perpetually under everything about whether it would be enough, whether the cattle prices would hold, whether the weather would cooperate, whether the dream would sustain itself, settled on him in a way he could not work off or sleep off. He did not hide it from Eudora, because hiding things from Eudora had never been something he was able to manage, and he had long since stopped trying. She saw it in the set of his shoulders in the evenings, in the quality of his silences, in the extra careful way he looked over the account books as though he could find something wrong if he looked hard enough. She waited for the right moment, and then she sat down beside him one evening when the children were asleep and took his hands in hers. "Tell me what you are carrying," she said. He did. He laid it out honestly, the fear and the tiredness and the feeling that he was always one bad season away from losing everything he had built and that the cost of vigilance was a specific kind of exhaustion. He talked for a long time, which was unusual for him, and she listened without speaking for most of it. When he finished, she said, "Isaiah, look at what we have." "I know what we have," he said. "Look at it," she said. "Not as what it might lose. Look at it as what it is." He looked at her. She held his gaze steadily. "We have 22 head," she said. "We have this house, which is our house completely. We have children who are healthy and bright and going to be extraordinary. We have the store, which is profitable and continuing to be. We have neighbors who would come tomorrow if we needed them. We have each other." She paused. "We built all of this from you selling your saddle on a train platform." He was quiet for a moment. "We built it from considerably more than that," he said. "From your work and my work and 9 years of making it together," she said, "which is a great deal of building to have done, and which has resulted in something genuinely worth having." She squeezed his hands. "You are allowed to be tired. You are allowed to be afraid sometimes. But I need you to know that what you have built is real and it is substantial, and you have not done it alone." He looked at her for a long time. "I know I have not done it alone," he said. "Good," she said. "Then rest in that." He did, eventually. The rough patch passed as they do, gradually and without a clear moment of ending, the weight lifting by degrees as the spring came and the cattle were healthy and the prices held steady and the fear had less to feed on. He came back to himself with the solidity of a man who has been tested and knows now more precisely what he is made of. In 1893, Clement turned 8 and Ada turned 5. And they were two distinct and fully formed people who were also unmistakably the children of the two people who had made them, in ways that were endlessly interesting to observe. Clement had his father's steadiness and his mother's precision, and he was already the kind of person people brought their problems to, even at 8, standing in the schoolyard with the air of a natural mediator. Ada had her mother's directness and her father's gray-green eyes, and a determination so absolute it was almost geological, and she had already beaten both her parents at chess on multiple occasions, and approached each victory with an equanimity that suggested she had expected nothing less. The family had become something recognized and respected in Abilene by this point, in the specific way of a community where people know each other's history. Eudora's store was a fixture of 2nd Street. Isaiah's cattle operation was known for the quality of its stock and the reliability of its owner. They were part of the texture of the town in the way you become when you have been somewhere for 10 years and built something honest. Margaret turned 65 in the spring of 1893 and showed no particular signs of modifying her schedule or outlook to accommodate the milestone. She had recently joined a women's reading circle in town that met on Thursday evenings and discussed books with a rigor that the participants called literary appreciation and their husbands called alarming. And she was teaching Ada to bake with the same competitive fervor she brought to chess instruction. Margaret was happy, specifically and genuinely happy, in the way of a person who has arrived at the life that suits them through a combination of loss and perseverance, and has learned to value what they have. One evening in the summer of 1893, Eudora found Isaiah sitting on the front porch in the long golden evening, watching the cattle in the lower pasture, with the expression she recognized as his particular version of contentment, quiet and inward and complete. She brought 2 cups of coffee and sat beside him, and they watched the evening together in the comfortable silence that is one of the gifts of a good long marriage, the ability to share a moment without having to narrate it. "I want to tell you something," he said eventually. "Tell me," she said. He looked out at the land, at the fence lines and the cattle and the cottonwoods moving in the evening wind. "The day I sold the saddle," he said, "I have never regretted it, not for 1 hour. I want you to know that." He looked at her. "I know you have thought about it, what it cost, whether it was right for me to do it. I want you to know that from the moment I walked away from that tack shop window, I have never once wished I had not done it." Eudora held her coffee cup in both hands and looked at him. "Even before you knew anything would come of it," she said. "It was not about what would come of it," he said. "It was the right thing to do at the moment it was done. Everything after that has been," he paused, searching for the right word, and then found it, "grace." She thought about grace, about the way things accumulate, the way a single moment of ordinary kindness from a stranger can reverberate through years and become the architecture of an entire life. About the woman she had been on that platform, compressed and armored and nearly out of fight, and the life she could not have imagined from that position. That was now her actual daily existence. "I love you," she said, which she said often and meant each time with the specific weight of the present moment, not as a habit but as a recognition. "I love you," he said, which he also said often and meant with the same specificity, the acknowledgement of who she was right now in this particular evening on this particular porch. They sat in the fading light until the stars came out, and the children's voices came from inside the house, Clement's reasonable tone and Ada's emphatic one in some ongoing negotiation, and the cattle settled in the lower pasture, and the cottonwoods whispered, and the creek ran patient and steady along the northern edge of the 20 acres that had become, through years of sustained intention, the place where Isaiah Finley and Eudora Hurst had made a life that stayed. The years continued to accumulate with the particular generosity of years, in which people are doing mostly the right things. By 1895, the ranch had grown to 30 head and employed Pablo full-time and a part-time hand besides, and Isaiah had been asked to serve on the county agricultural board, which he did with the same thoroughness he brought to everything. Eudora's store had become the most profitable business on 2nd Street, and she had begun mentoring a young woman recently arrived in Abilene, a 20-year-old named Clara Weiss, who was exactly the kind of capable and determined and slightly frightened person that Eudora had learned to recognize and make room for. Clara reminded her, in certain lights, of the woman on the platform. Not precisely. Clara's circumstances were different. Her story was her own. But there was something in the set of her shoulders and the precision of her composure when she was in difficulty that Eudora knew from the inside, and she remembered what it felt like to have someone see it and help without making it a transaction. She gave Clara the seamstress position, and then, over the following months, began teaching her everything she knew about running the business end of a retail establishment, the buying and the selling and the management of credit and the keeping of books. Clara absorbed all of it with a hunger that was lovely to watch. Eudora did not require thanks, and she did not make the help feel like a gift that required repayment. She made it feel like the obvious next thing, because she had learned from a man on a train platform that the most powerful thing about genuine help is that it carries no weight. One afternoon Eudora found herself looking at Clara behind the counter and thinking about Caldwell and the train and Isaiah's saddle, and she went home that evening and told Isaiah about it. "She is going to be all right," Eudora said. "I can see it already. She has what it takes. Like someone else I could name," he said. "I was lucky," Eudora said. "You were also what it takes," he said. "Both things." She leaned against him, there on the porch in the 1895 evening, with the 10 years of the life they had built together all around them in the warm air, and felt the truth of it. Both things, the luck and the self. The saddle sold by a stranger, and the woman who had gotten on the train with her 80 cents and her wounded pride and her absolute determination to find a way through. Clement turned 11 in 1896 and had the future written all over him in the specific way some children do. A rancher's son who read everything and asked questions about everything, and had the useful quality of making adults feel that their experience was genuinely valuable. He was his father's shadow on the ranch on weekends and holidays, learning the cattle work with real competence now, able to read the animals and the land with an instinct that Isaiah recognized as the thing that either comes or does not come, and cannot be taught. He and Pablo had developed a friendship that crossed the difference in their ages with the ease of two people who simply liked each other, and Pablo had begun teaching him Spanish with the same matter-of-fact generosity that Isaiah had always shown him. Ada at 8 was a force unto herself. She was at the top of her class at school without appearing to try, had read every book in Margaret's house and was working through Eudora's collection, played chess at a level that alarmed her teachers, and had recently begun demanding to learn to ride properly rather than the gentle supervised turns on the horses' backs that she had been permitted so far. Isaiah started teaching her properly that fall, and she approached it with the total commitment of someone taking on the most important undertaking of her life. And within a month, she was riding with a confidence that made both her parents slightly nervous and extremely proud. Margaret's health began to shift in small ways in 1897, nothing dramatic, only the gradual adjustments of age, a stiffness in the mornings that kept her from the garden as much as she liked, a tiredness in the afternoons that she dealt with by sitting with a book and calling it deliberate. She was 69, and she had been vigorous and present for so long that the adjustments surprised everyone, including her. She came to live at the ranch in the spring of 1898, which had been suggested by Eudora, and agreed to by Margaret after a period of resistance that lasted exactly as long as it took Margaret to admit to herself that she was lonely in the house on Vine Street, and that the ranch was the place she most wanted to be. She had a room of her own, the back room with the east-facing window that caught the morning light, and she brought her blue curtains. The addition of Margaret to the daily household transformed it in the ways that good additions do, adding warmth and dimension and the specific pleasure of her company. The Thursday reading circle relocated to the ranch parlor, which Isaiah bore with magnificent patience, and the chess education of Ada reached new levels of intensity now that Margaret had full access to her granddaughter by spirit on a daily basis. Eudora was glad to have her there in a way that she had not anticipated being, had not known she was missing until the gap was filled. She and Margaret talked in the evenings with the ease of women who had been family to each other through enough years and enough of life's weather to have arrived at a bedrock honesty. Margaret talked about her husband sometimes, about the years before his death, with the measured openness of someone who has had time to make peace with loss and is able to give it its proper shape. Eudora talked about her mother, which she rarely did, finding that with Margaret the distance of time and the safety of the relationship made it possible to say things she had not said aloud before. "She would have liked you enormously," Eudora said one evening, meaning Isaiah. "Tell me why," said Margaret, who always wanted specifics. "Because he does not perform," Eudora said. "He is the same in every circumstance." She had a way of seeing through performance, and she was always impatient with it. She would have looked at him for 30 seconds and she would have known. "Known what?" Margaret asked. "That he is exactly who he says he is," Eudora said. Margaret nodded slowly. "That is the rarest thing," she said. "I know," Eudora said. "I have never taken it for granted." Not for a day. Isaiah was 43 in 1898 and had arrived at that age with the kind of ease that belongs to men who have been honest with themselves about what matters and have organized their lives accordingly. He was not a wealthy man by any broad measure, but he was prosperous in the specific sense of having enough and knowing it. The ranch was solid and improving. His children were extraordinary. His wife was the most interesting and capable person he had ever known, and he was still, 15 years into it, learning new dimensions of both. There was a morning in late September of 1898, a Saturday, when the fall was properly in the air, and the cottonwoods were turning gold, and the light had the angled clarity of autumn. Isaiah was up before anyone else, which was usual, and he walked out across the land in the early morning with his coffee, as he often did, checking the fence line and the cattle and the general state of things. He stood for a while at the north edge of the property, where the cottonwoods were thickest, looking south across the 20 acres and beyond to the neighboring properties, and beyond that to Abilene's rooflines in the distance. He thought about the platform in Caldwell. He thought about a younger version of himself with a saddle over his shoulder, a man who had been saving for years and had a plan and was beginning to be able to see it taking shape, and who had nevertheless looked at a woman on a trunk and felt with absolute certainty that the saddle was less important than her getting on the train. He thought about all the years between that moment and this one, the cattle drives and the hard winters, and the first nights in the cabin and Eudora's voice across the kitchen table and Clement's first cry and Ada laughing from the back of her horse and Margaret's blue curtains in the east window, the whole accumulated treasury of it. He heard the porch door and turned, and Eudora was there in the morning light in her work dress with her dark hair down, carrying 2 cups, because she always brought 2 cups when she came to find him. She came to stand beside him, gave him the second cup, and looked out at the land the way they had learned to look at it together, as something they had made and something that had also made them. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. They stood in the September morning, the cottonwoods gold around them and the cattle moving in the lower pasture and the whole living, continuing, deeply satisfying fact of the life they had built from a saddle and a train ticket and an unlikely conversation on a prairie platform. And it was enough, more than enough. It was everything that mattered, standing solid and real and abiding in the morning light. Within the house behind them, they could hear Clement moving around, already up and purposeful at 13, and Ada's voice asking a question that nobody had answered yet to her satisfaction, and Margaret's laugh responding to it, warm and carrying, and the sounds of the morning were the sounds of their life, and their life was whole and good and fully, completely, irreversibly theirs. Eudora reached over and took Isaiah's hand. He held it without looking at her, looking instead at the land, the fence line true and the cattle sound and the cottonwoods brilliant in the morning. "Isaiah," she said. He said. "Thank you," she said, "for selling your saddle." He turned to look at her then, and his gray-green eyes in the September morning held all of it, the Caldwell platform and the years between and this morning specifically, and he smiled, which was the particular smile she had been collecting for 15 years and had never once stopped finding worth having. "Thank you," he said, "for getting on the train." She laughed and he laughed, and the cottonwoods moved in the morning wind, and the land held them, and the life they had built together went on.